gentle souls, to this quiet corner where ancient myths whisper their secrets beneath starlit skies, where the wisdom of old Greece flows like honey through moonbeams, and where every story becomes a pathway to peaceful rest. You have found your way to Greek myths for sleep, where timeless tales unfold like petals in the gentle night breeze, carrying you toward dreams as old as marble temples and as soft as olive leaves dancing in Mediterranean winds. Before we begin this ancient journey together, if you find comfort in these whispered legends and feel your spirit drawn to these mystical realms, please consider subscribing to Greek Myths for Sleep and leaving a gentle like on this video. Your quiet support helps these stories reach other weary travelers who seek the same peaceful harbor you do tonight. Souls who yearn for the ancient comfort that only these timeless tales can bring. Now, let us drift together into the misty realm where gods once walked among mortals, where heroes were born from both divine blessing and human courage, and where every stone held memory and every shadow held story. Close your eyes if you wish, and let your breathing slow like the gentle lapping of waves against ancient harbors. For tonight we journey to a time when the Aegean Sea reflected not just stars, but the very dreams of a civilization that painted its wisdom across marble and bronze, across temple walls, and the hearts of those who listened. In the soft blue hours before dawn, when the world exists in that tender space between sleep and waking, our story begins in Athens, that shining city blessed by wise Athena herself. The olive trees that crowned her hills rustled with secrets carried on winds that had touched the very faces of gods, and the marble columns of her temples caught the first tentative light like ancient prayers made manifest in stone. This was a city where wisdom bloomed like flowers after gentle rain, where philosophers walked cobbled streets still warm from yesterday's sun, and where the very air seemed touched by divinity. But even in this blessed place, shadows gathered like storm clouds on distant horizons. For Athens, despite all her beauty and wisdom, found herself bound by an ancient debt, a burden that fell across her people like the weight of accumulated years. Far across the wine-dark sea, on the island of Crete, there ruled a king whose power stretched like the roots of ancient trees, deep and unyielding. King Minos commanded not just armies and fleets, but something far more terrible in its magnificent horror, something that dwelt in the very heart of his palace, in passages that wound like the dreams of sleeping gods. The debt was old, older than the memory of many who lived in Athens, yet it remained as sharp and present as morning frost on temple steps. Every 7 years, like the turning of some cosmic wheel, Athens was required to send a tribute across the sea to Crete. Not gold or silver, not grain or wine, but something infinitely more precious and painful to give. 7 young men and 7 young women, the brightest flowers of Athenian youth, would board ships and sail toward an uncertain fate, families watching from the harbor, until the white sails disappeared into the horizon like dreams fading at dawn. These young people, chosen by lots drawn from golden urns, would arrive at the palace of King Minos and be led into a place from which no soul had ever returned. It was said that beneath the palace lay a labyrinth, a maze so complex and vast that it defied the understanding of mortal minds, created by the master craftsman Daedalus at the command of the king. And at the very heart of this labyrinth, in chambers that knew neither sun nor moon, dwelt a creature born of divine punishment and mortal consequence, a being both terrible and pitiable in its eternal solitude. This creature was called the Minotaur, and its very existence spoke to the complex tapestries that the gods wove from the threads of mortal actions. Half man and half bull, it possessed the strength of the earth itself and the fury of storms unleashed, yet also carried within its massive frame the terrible loneliness of one who belonged neither to the world of humans nor to the realm of beasts. The Minotaur was both victim and executioner, prisoner and guardian, a living reminder that even kings must answer for their choices when those choices displease the immortal powers that shape the world. The labyrinth itself was a wonder beyond imagination, its walls rising like cliff faces into darkness, its passages branching and turning in patterns that seemed to shift even as one walked them. Daedalus had crafted it with such skill that anyone who entered would find themselves lost within moments. The very architecture designed to confuse and disorient, to make every step lead deeper into its heart rather than back toward light and freedom. The walls were smooth as silk, impossible to climb, and the passages echoed with whispers that might have been wind or might have been the voices of those who had wandered there before. Their words, now part of the very stones themselves. Into this tribute of young lives came the thread that would weave our story. For in Athens, there lived a prince whose heart burned with the fire of justice, and whose spirit could not rest while his people suffered. Theseus was his name, and though royal blood flowed in his veins, he had not lived a life of pampered ease. He had journeyed to Athens from Trozen, where his mother Aethra had raised him in relative obscurity, teaching him that true nobility came not from birth alone, but from the choices one made when faced with darkness. Theseus had already proven himself a hero on the roads between Trozen and Athens, facing bandits and monsters with a courage that seemed to flow from some deep well within his soul. He cleared the paths of danger so that travelers could walk safely, and his deeds were already being sung by bards in taverns and told by mothers to their children as examples of what mortals could achieve when they aligned themselves with righteousness. Yet for all his accomplishments, his greatest test lay ahead, hidden in the coiling passages beneath a foreign palace. When the time came once again for Athens to pay her terrible tribute, and the lots were drawn from the golden urns in the temple of Athena, Theseus watched as 14 young people were chosen, their faces pale with understanding of what their fate would be. These were not criminals or outcasts, but the best of Athens, young men who might have become artists or philosophers, young women who might have raised families or become priestesses, all now bound for the dark heart of the labyrinth. The sight of their quiet courage, their acceptance of a fate they had not chosen, struck Theseus like lightning from a clear sky. In that moment, standing in the temple where olive oil burned in sacred lamps and incense rose like prayers made visible, Theseus made a decision that would echo through the ages. He approached his father, King Aegeus, and declared his intention to join the tribute ship, to take the place of one of the chosen young men and sail to Crete to face whatever waited in the labyrinth. The king's face grew as pale as moonlight on marble, for he knew the reputation of the Minotaur and the inescapable nature of the labyrinth. Yet he also knew his son's nature, the fire of determination that once lit could not easily be extinguished. The decision was made with the weight of love and loss, for Aegeus agreed to let his son go, knowing that to forbid him would only drive Theseus to find another way. They stood together on the palace balcony, father and son, looking out over the city that spread below them like a tapestry of white stone and red tile, of gardens and fountains, and the lives of people they both loved. The king gave his son a gift then, black sails to replace the white ones that traditionally marked the tribute ship, with instructions that if Theseus survived and returned victorious, he should change them back to white so that from the harbor watch, his father would know the outcome of the journey before the ship even reached shore. The night before departure was spent in preparation, both practical and spiritual. Theseus visited the temple of Poseidon, for his divine father would have influence over the seas that must be crossed. He prayed not for easy victory, but for the strength to face whatever challenges awaited, and for the wisdom to find a path where none seemed to exist. The priests burned offerings of honey and wine, and the sweet smoke rose into the starlit sky like messages carried to the gods on invisible wings. In the temple of Athena, Theseus sought the blessing of wisdom, for he knew that strength alone would not navigate the labyrinth or defeat its guardian. The goddess of strategy and careful planning was said to look kindly on those who approached their challenges with both courage and intelligence. And Theseus spent long hours in meditation, seeking the inner calm that would serve him when surrounded by confusion and threat. The owls that were sacred to Athena called from the olive trees, their voices carrying across the night like whispered promises that wisdom would light his path even in the darkest hours. When dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, the tribute ship waited at the harbor, its black sails furled like the wings of some great resting bird. The 14 young Athenians stood ready to board, their families gathered on the quay to bid them farewell. There were tears, but they were quiet tears, For these people understood that their sorrow was part of a larger story, part of the price that mortals sometimes paid for the conflicts and consequences that flowed from the world of the gods into the world of human cities. Theseus joined them, and something in his presence seemed to kindle a small flame of hope in their hearts. Though none dared speak of it openly, some inner voice whispered that perhaps this time would be different, that perhaps this prince, who had already proven himself a slayer of monsters and a protector of the innocent, might find a way to break the cycle that had claimed so many young lives. They looked at him as he stood at the ship's rail, his dark hair stirring in the morning breeze, his eyes fixed on the horizon where their destiny waited. And they felt that they sailed with something more than mere hope. The journey across the Aegean Sea unfolded like a dream painted in blue and white. The ship moving smoothly through waters that reflected the sky so perfectly that it seemed they sailed through clouds rather than waves. Dolphins played in the ship's wake, their sleek forms leaping and diving in joyous arcs that reminded the young people that beauty and wonder still existed in the world, even as they journeyed toward uncertainty. The wind filled their black sails with the breath of Poseidon himself, carrying them steadily toward Crete as the sun traced its ancient path across the heavens. During the voyage, Theseus spoke quietly with his companions, learning their names and their stories, their hopes and fears. There was Milos, who had been studying music and could make the ship's ropes sing like lyres when the wind caught them just so. There was Perigune, whose knowledge of herbs and healing plants was already remarkable despite her youth, and who pointed out sea birds and their meanings as they flew overhead. Each of the 14 had gifts and talents that made their loss even more tragic. Yet Theseus encouraged them to speak of these things, to remember who they were beyond their roles as tribute. As they shared stories and dreams, a strange thing happened. The young people began to transform from isolated individuals facing certain doom into something like a community, a gathering of souls united by shared purpose. They were still afraid, for they were mortal, and the fear of death is woven into mortal hearts like thread into cloth. Yet they also began to feel something else, a sense that they participated in a story larger than themselves, that their journey might mark not just another tragedy, but a turning point in the long relationship between their city and the distant king who held their fate in his hands. The ship sailed on through waters that grew warmer as they approached the island kingdom of Crete, and the sun seemed to burn more golden, more ancient, as though they approached not just a different place, but a different time, where the gods walked closer to the earth, and their influence could be felt in every stone and stream. Schools of fish swam beneath the clear water like living jewels, and the very air seemed to shimmer with possibilities, as though the boundaries between what was real and what was mythical grew thinner with each nautical mile they covered. When the island of Crete finally appeared on the horizon, rising from the sea like a sleeping giant covered in green and gold. The hearts of the young Athenians quickened with a mixture of awe and apprehension. This was the seat of the ancient Minoan civilization, a kingdom that had ruled the waves when Athens was just a collection of villages around a rocky hill. The palace of King Minos was said to be a wonder beyond imagination, filled with frescoes that seemed to move in lamplight and corridors that opened onto gardens where exotic flowers bloomed in patterns that told stories older than memory. The harbor of Knossos welcomed them with surprising beauty, its stone quays polished smooth by countless years of use, its waters so clear that the harbor bottom was visible even in the deeper sections. Ships from across the Mediterranean bobbed at anchor here. Vessels from Egypt with their distinctive reed sails, trading ships from Phoenicia heavy with purple dye and fine cloth, fishing boats that smelled of salt and yesterday's catch, and war galleys whose bronze-reinforced prows gleamed like the weapons of gods. As their ship was guided to its berth by harbor pilots who seemed to know their purpose without being told, the young Athenians caught their first glimpse of the palace that would be their destination. It rose from the center of the city like a mountain built by divine architects, its walls painted in colors that had no names in their homeland. Deep blues that captured the essence of deep ocean, reds that held all the warmth of sunset, yellows that seemed to contain sunlight itself. Gardens cascaded down its terraced sides, and fountains sent streams of water dancing through the air in patterns that created brief rainbows when the light struck them just so. The people of Crete who gathered to watch their arrival were not cruel or celebrating, but rather solemn, as though they too were part of a ritual that brought them no joy. Children peered from behind their parents' robes with curious eyes, while priests in white garments observed from temple steps, their faces marked by an understanding that some events are larger than any individual's desire to change them. The very air seemed heavy with the weight of tradition and repetition, with the sense that this scene had played out many times before and would continue to play out until some greater force intervened to break the pattern. Guards met them at the quay, but these were not rough soldiers, but rather men who carried themselves with the dignity of those who serve a higher purpose. They wore armor that had been crafted with art as much as protection in mind. Bronze worked into patterns that told stories of bulls and dolphins, of harvest festivals and sacred rites. They treated the young Athenians with a respect that might seem strange given their purpose, yet which spoke to the complex nature of their situation. They were prisoners, yet they were also participants in a sacred obligation that bound their cities together across the wine-dark sea. The procession from the harbor to the palace moved slowly through streets, paved with stones worn smooth by centuries of use. The buildings they passed were unlike anything in Athens, their walls decorated with images that seemed to pulse with life, swimmers diving with dolphins, young people leaping over the horns of charging bulls, priestesses dancing with serpents that coiled around their arms like living jewelry. Gardens bloomed between buildings, filled with flowers that released fragrances into the warm air, and fountains provided the constant musical backdrop of flowing water. The palace itself defied description, for it seemed less like a single building than like a small city built in layers across the hillside. Corridors opened onto courtyards that led to stairways that climbed to terraces that looked down into other courtyards, all connected by a logic that spoke more to artistic vision than practical planning. The walls were covered in frescoes that told stories spanning generations, while the floors were paved with stones arranged in patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering light of oil lamps set in bronze holders shaped like flowering branches. As they were led deeper into the palace complex, the young Athenians began to understand that they had entered a place where the ordinary rules of architecture and space seemed not to apply. Corridors that should have led to dead ends opened onto vast halls, while passages that appeared to stretch straight ahead somehow curved back upon themselves. It was as though the very palace was a smaller version of the labyrinth that waited somewhere beneath their feet, a place where the mind could become lost, even while the body remained safe. They were brought at last to a hall where King Minos held court, and here the full majesty of Cretan civilization revealed itself. The king sat upon a throne carved from a single block of stone that seemed to capture light and hold it, while around him courtiers dressed in garments that flowed like water moved in patterns that suggested dance more than mere walking. The walls here told the story of the labyrinth itself, showing the master craftsman Daedalus at work with tools that seemed too delicate for such massive construction, and images of the creature that dwelt at its heart, portrayed not as a simple monster, but as something complex and tragic, deserving of both fear and pity. King Minos himself was not the tyrant that distance and legend had made him seem, but rather a man bearing the weight of choices made long ago, choices that had seemed wise or necessary at the time, but which had grown into obligations that bound him as surely as they bound those who paid the tribute. His face carried the marks of someone who had seen too much of both divine blessing and divine punishment, who understood that mortal kings are sometimes merely instruments through which the gods work out their own complex purposes. The formalities were observed with a dignity that honored both the Athenian youth and the solemnity of the occasion. Wine was offered and politely refused, for none felt able to drink while facing their fate. Music played softly from hidden corners, melodies that seemed to speak of ancient sorrows and distant hopes. The king spoke words that had been spoken before, explaining the nature of their situation with neither cruelty nor false comfort, acknowledging that they faced something terrible yet necessary in the cosmic order that governed the relationships between cities and the debts that accumulated between them. Yet even as the ritual unfolded according to ancient custom, something unexpected stirred in the great hall. Among the courtiers, among the priests and advisors who surrounded the throne, there was one whose attention fixed upon the young Athenian prince with an intensity that went beyond mere curiosity. Princess Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, had watched many such groups of young people arrive at her father's court, and she had learned to harden her heart against their fate, for sympathy served no purpose when the outcome was fixed by powers greater than individual will. But something in Theseus drew her gaze and held it, something that spoke to the part of her spirit that had never quite accepted that the world must always remain as it was, that cycles of sacrifice and sorrow were truly unbreakable. Perhaps it was the way he stood, neither defiant nor cowering, but simply present, fully occupying the moment without attempting to flee it mentally or emotionally. Perhaps it was the manner in which he looked upon her father, seeing not an enemy, but a man caught in circumstances that transcended personal choice. Whatever the quality that caught her attention, it kindled something in her heart that had long remained dormant. Princess Ariadne possessed more than beauty, though beauty she certainly had, with hair that caught light like spun gold and eyes that held depths reminiscent of the clearest mountain pools. She had inherited her father's intelligence and her mother's intuition, combining these gifts with an education that included not just the arts of court and ceremony, but also the deeper mysteries that governed the relationship between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. She understood the labyrinth not just as a physical structure, but as a symbol of the complexity that governed all existence, the maze of choices and consequences that every soul must navigate in the journey from birth to whatever lay beyond. That evening, as the Athenian youth were given quarters in the palace and time to prepare themselves for the trial that awaited with the dawn, Ariadne found herself unable to dismiss the image of the young prince from her thoughts. She walked the corridors of the palace as she had done countless times before. Yet now they seemed different, charged with possibility in a way that made her question assumptions she had never thought to examine. The frescoes on the walls seemed to watch her pass, and the oil lamps flickered as though stirred by breezes that carried whispers from distant places. In her private chambers, surrounded by treasures gathered from across the Mediterranean world, Ariadne contemplated the nature of fate and choice. Was the future truly fixed, written in stars and stone and the decrees of immortal powers? Or did moments arise when individual action could redirect the flow of events, like a river temporarily diverted by a carefully placed stone? The question had philosophical implications that extended far beyond the immediate situation. Yet, it also had intensely personal ramifications, for she found herself imagining possibilities that had never occurred to her before. The princess possessed something that could change the nature of the trial awaiting Theseus and his companions. Something that had been given to her by Daedalus himself before the master craftsman had been imprisoned by her father's fears and jealousy. It was a ball of thread, but thread unlike any spun by mortal hands, for it had been woven with intentions as much as fibers, crafted to serve as a guide through confusion and a connection to safety when all other landmarks failed. Daedalus had given it to her with words that at the time had seemed merely cryptic, but which now resonated with prophetic weight. Someday, he had said, this thread might serve to bind together what seemed destined to remain forever separate. As the night deepened and the palace settled into the rhythms of sleep, Ariadne made her decision. It was not made lightly or impulsively, but with full understanding of the risks involved and the likelihood that her action would bring consequences she could not foresee or control. Yet sometimes, she realized, the heart knows truths that the mind cannot calculate, and the spirit demands action even when prudence counsels patience. She would find a way to speak with the Athenian prince before dawn brought the opening of the labyrinth. The meeting took place in a garden courtyard where fountains provided enough sound to mask whispered conversation, and where the shadows of olive trees offered concealment from any who might observe. Theseus had not been sleeping, for his mind was focused on the challenge ahead, on the question of how one navigated a maze designed to prevent escape and defeated a creature whose strength exceeded that of mortal men. When the princess appeared like a figure from a dream, her presence seemed both impossible and inevitable, as though their meeting had been written into the very structure of the story long before either of them had been born. Their conversation unfolded with the careful intensity of two people who recognize that they stand at a crossroads, not just in their own lives, but in the larger patterns that govern the world around them. Ariadne spoke of the labyrinth with the knowledge of one who had grown up hearing its secrets, describing not just its physical layout, but its psychological effects, the way it undermined confidence and direction, until even the strongest will begin to doubt its own purpose. She explained how the passages were designed to amplify sound in some places and muffle it in others, how the very air moved in patterns that could confuse the senses, and how the architecture itself seemed to shift subtly, as though the walls were alive and capable of rearranging themselves. The Minotaur itself, she revealed, was not simply a beast driven by hunger and fury, but a creature whose solitude had driven it to a state that transcended simple madness. Years of isolation in the heart of the maze had given it an intimate knowledge of every passage and chamber, an ability to move through the labyrinth with the ease of a fish swimming through familiar waters. Yet this same isolation had also made it desperate for contact, for the sound of another voice, for any break in the endless repetition of its own footsteps echoing through empty corridors. Understanding this, she suggested, might provide the key to survival that strength alone could never offer. Then, with hands that trembled slightly despite her resolve, Ariadne offered Theseus the ball of thread that Daedalus had crafted with such care. She explained its properties, how it would unwind behind him as he traveled deeper into the labyrinth, yet would never tangle or break, and how following it back would lead him unerringly to the entrance regardless of how many turns he had taken or how lost he had become. The thread represented more than navigation. It represented the connection between the heart of darkness and the world of light, the assurance that even in the deepest confusion, a path home would always exist. But there was a condition, spoken quietly yet with absolute firmness. If Theseus succeeded in his quest, if he managed to emerge from the labyrinth alive, he must take her with him when he sailed back to Athens. The princess understood that her father would never forgive her intervention, that her life in Crete was forfeit the moment she chose to aid the Athenian prince. She was willing to accept exile from everything she had known, willing to trade the certainty of royal privilege for the uncertainty of a new life in a foreign land. If only the cycle of death and tribute could finally be broken. Theseus accepted both the gift and the condition without hesitation, for he recognized in her offer not just practical aid, but a spirit that matched his own commitment to justice and change. They sealed their agreement not with grand gestures or dramatic vows, but with the quiet intensity of two people who understood that they had chosen to step outside the prescribed patterns of their lives and create something new from their combined courage and determination. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of pearl and rose, the preparations for the labyrinth trial began with the solemnity of ancient ritual. The 14 young Athenians were brought to the entrance of the maze, a doorway carved into living rock and decorated with symbols that seemed to shift in the flickering light of torches held by silent guards. The opening itself was impressive in its simplicity, a dark archway that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, beyond which passages stretched into depths that no surface illumination could penetrate. The Athenian youth stood together for what they all knew might be the last time, drawing strength from their companionship, even as they prepared to be separated by the twisting passages that awaited them. They had discussed strategy during the night, agreeing that they would try to stay together as long as possible, that they would call out to each other to maintain contact, and that they would face whatever they found in the labyrinth's heart as a united group rather than as individuals. Yet they also understood that the maze was designed to fragment such unity, to isolate each person in their own private struggle against confusion and despair. Theseus carried the thread hidden within his tunic, its weight negligible, yet its presence infinitely comforting. He had attached one end to a projection of stone near the entrance, disguising the action as a simple gesture of checking his equipment. The thread was remarkable in its properties, thinner than the finest silk, yet stronger than any rope, and possessed of an almost supernatural ability to remain untangled, no matter how complex the path it followed. As he prepared to enter the darkness, he felt the thread's gentle tension against his fingers, a constant reminder that no matter how lost he became, a connection to the world of light would always exist. The labyrinth entrance swallowed them like the mouth of some vast creature, and immediately they understood that all their preparations could only partially address the reality they now faced. The darkness was not absolute, for phosphorescent materials embedded in the walls provided a dim, greenish glow that allowed basic navigation. Yet this light seemed to make the shadows more confusing rather than less, creating the illusion of movement where none existed and depth where the eye could find none. The passages were wide enough for two people to walk side by side, yet the acoustics created by their construction made every footstep echo strangely, sometimes seeming to come from ahead, sometimes from behind, sometimes from directions that defied logical explanation. The air moved in subtle currents that carried scents both familiar and strange. The dampness of deep earth, the metallic tang of ancient bronze, and underneath it all, something that might have been the musk of a large animal. Though whether that animal was near or far, none could determine. They had not walked for long before the labyrinth began to work its intended effect upon their minds and spirits. Passages that seemed to lead steadily deeper suddenly curved back upon themselves. Corridors that appeared identical led to completely different destinations. Intersections offered choices between paths that all looked equally promising and equally threatening. And soon even Theseus, despite his thread, began to feel the weight of confusion that the maze imposed upon all who entered it. Yet the thread proved its worth, for even when his mind began to doubt his sense of direction, even when the constant echoing of footsteps made it impossible to tell which sounds came from his own group and which might come from something else moving through the passages, the gentle tension of the thread provided an anchor of certainty in a world designed to undermine all certainty. He could feel it unrolling behind him, marking his path through the confusion. And this knowledge allowed him to focus on the challenge ahead rather than the fear of becoming eternally lost. As they moved deeper into the labyrinth, the character of the passages began to change. The phosphorescent glow grew dimmer, making them more dependent on the torches they carried, yet also more aware of how the flickering light created an ever-changing landscape of shadow and illumination. The walls here were carved with symbols and images that seemed to tell a story, though whether it was the story of the labyrinth's construction, the tale of those who had entered before them, or some other narrative entirely, none could say. The young Athenians had managed to stay together through the first several turns and intersections. But gradually, the labyrinth's design began to separate them despite their intentions. Passages narrowed to allow only single-file passage, then widened into chambers with multiple exits. Corridors branched in ways that forced choices between directions, and though they called out to each other to maintain contact, the strange acoustics made it increasingly difficult to determine where voices were coming from or how far away they might be. Theseus found himself in a section of the maze where the walls rose higher than in the outer passages, creating the sensation of walking through a deep canyon rather than a human-built structure. The thread continued to unroll behind him with perfect reliability. Yet, he began to hear sounds that had not been present before. A deep breathing that seemed to come from the stone itself, and occasionally, a sound that might have been footsteps larger and heavier than those made by human feet. The realization came gradually that he was no longer hearing the voices of his companions, that the labyrinth had succeeded in isolating him from the others, despite all their efforts to remain together. This understanding brought with it a profound loneliness, yet also a strange peace, for he knew that his thread would lead him back to the entrance, where, God's willing, he might find the others waiting. His task now was not to rescue all of them, for that was beyond any mortal's power, but to reach the heart of the labyrinth and face whatever waited there. The passages grew warmer as he descended, and the air carried scents that spoke of animal presence, the musk he had noticed before, but stronger now, and underneath it the smell of old bones and leather, of a creature that had lived long in places where the sun never shone. The phosphorescent materials in the walls here pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost like a heartbeat, creating the unsettling impression that the labyrinth itself was alive, that he walked through the arteries of some vast sleeping creature that might wake at any moment. At last, the passage opened into a chamber larger than any they had encountered, a circular space with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadows above the reach of torchlight. This was clearly the heart of the labyrinth, the destination that all the twisting passages had been designed to conceal and protect. The walls here were smooth, worn by years of contact with something large that had brushed against them repeatedly, and the floor was covered with sand that muffled footsteps and bore the impressions of movement too large to be human. In the center of this chamber, curled in sleep like some impossible sculpture brought to life, lay the Minotaur. Even in rest, it was magnificent and terrible, its massive form combining the muscular power of a bull with the general proportions of a man. Though enlarged beyond any human scale, its breathing created the sound he had been hearing, deep and regular, filling the chamber with a rhythm that seemed older than civilization. Its hide was dark as midnight, and in the dim light, it seemed less like a creature of flesh and blood than like a force of nature given form. Yet as Theseus watched, torch held high to illuminate the scene, he began to see details that complicated his understanding of what he faced. The Minotaur's position spoke of exhaustion rather than mere sleep, the weariness of a creature that had found no rest despite years of solitude. Its massive hands were scarred from contact with the stone walls, and its eyes, though closed, moved beneath their lids in patterns that suggested dreams troubled by the weight of consciousness, trapped in a form that belonged neither to the world of beasts nor to the world of thinking beings. The approach required more courage than any battle Theseus had ever fought, for he was walking toward a creature whose awakening might mean his immediate death, yet whose continued sleep seemed almost sacrilegious to disturb. Each step across the sandy floor sounded impossibly loud, despite the muffling effect of the sand, and each breath seemed to echo in the vast chamber like the wind through empty temples. The thread unrolled behind him, his only connection to the world he had known. Yet now it seemed almost an intrusion, a reminder of a reality too small to encompass what he faced. The Minotaur's awakening came gradually, not with the sudden alertness of a wild animal disturbed in its lair, but with the slow recognition of one who had been waiting, perhaps for years, for this moment to arrive. Its eyes opened to reveal not the mindless fury that legend attributed to it, but an intelligence made strange by isolation, a consciousness that had been forced to create its own world within the confines of the labyrinth. When it rose to its feet, the movement was fluid despite its massive size, speaking to strength that had never been tested to its limits. They faced each other across the sandy floor of the chamber, human and creature, mortal prince and legendary monster. Yet the confrontation that followed defied all the expectations that either legends or logic might have created. The Minotaur did not charge immediately, nor did Theseus draw the sword that hung at his side. Instead, they regarded each other with the careful attention of two beings trying to understand something that transcended the simple categories of enemy and prey, hunter and hunted. The creature's voice, when it came, was like the sound of wind through deep caves, carrying words that were recognizably Greek yet shaped by a throat not designed for human speech. It spoke of solitude that had stretched beyond the boundaries of time, of dreams that had become more real than waking life, of memories that might have belonged to the human part of its nature, or might have been fantasies created by a mind desperate for contact with something beyond itself. It asked questions that had no answers. Why it had been created, what purpose its existence served, whether the gods who had decreed its birth had also decreed its death. Theseus found himself responding not as a warrior facing an enemy, but as one consciousness reaching out to another across a gap that seemed unbridgeable, yet somehow was being bridged. He spoke of Athens and the tribute that had brought him here, of the young people who had disappeared into the labyrinth over the years, of the cycle of death and debt that bound their cities together. Yet he also spoke of choice and change, of the possibility that patterns established by gods and kings might still be altered by the actions of those who refused to accept that the future must always mirror the past. The conversation that unfolded in that chamber deep beneath the palace of King Minos was unlike any that had ever taken place in the labyrinth. For it was the first time in years that the Minotaur had heard a voice other than its own. The first time its words had fallen upon ears capable of understanding and responding. The creature spoke of the other young people who had found their way to this chamber, how they had arrived already broken by the maze's psychological assault, how their terror had made any communication impossible, how their deaths had been almost merciful releases from a suffering that served no purpose anyone could name. Yet something in Theseus was different, the Minotaur observed. Perhaps it was the thread that connected him to the outer world, providing an anchor of hope that the others had lacked. Perhaps it was his nature as a hero, a soul touched by divine purpose and mortal determination. Or perhaps it was simply that he had arrived at a moment when the creature's own despair had reached a depth that made any change seem preferable to the endless repetition of solitary existence. The resolution, when it came, surprised them both. The Minotaur, in a voice heavy with the weight of years and the exhaustion of consciousness trapped in an impossible situation, made a request that transformed the nature of their encounter entirely. It asked not for battle, not for the chance to prove its strength against a worthy opponent, but for release from a life that had become unbearable in its isolation and purposelessness. It spoke of death not as defeat, but as a gift, the final kindness that one being could offer another when suffering had become the only constant in existence. Theseus understood that he faced a choice that would define not just his own story, but the meaning of heroism itself. He could fight the Minotaur in fair combat, testing his strength and skill against a creature of legendary power, possibly winning glory through victory or honor through a brave defeat. Or he could accept the role of one who brings mercy rather than conquest, who ends suffering rather than causing it, who serves compassion rather than merely justice. The decision came from some deep part of his nature that understood the difference between destruction and resolution, between conquest and completion. With movements that carried the solemnity of ritual, he drew his sword not as a weapon, but as an instrument of release, approaching the Minotaur with the reverence due to one who has suffered beyond the capacity of mortal beings to comprehend. The creature knelt to make the task easier. Its massive head bowed in an attitude that spoke of gratitude rather than submission. The end came quickly and quietly, without struggle or suffering, more like the completion of a long-held prayer than like death by violence. The Minotaur's final breath carried with it what might have been words of thanks, or might have been simply the sound of air leaving lungs that had grown tired of their burden. In that moment, the chamber seemed to fill with a presence that transcended the physical, as though something that had been trapped for years had finally found its way to freedom. Theseus stood alone in the heart of the labyrinth, the thread still connecting him to the distant entrance, the body of the Minotaur at his feet, bearing no resemblance to the terrible monster of legend. Death had restored to the creature's features something approaching peace, and the massive form seemed less threatening than tragic, a reminder of the complexity that often lies hidden beneath simple stories of good and evil, hero and monster. The journey back through the labyrinth followed the thread's guidance with a reliability that made the outward journey seem like a dream of confusion and uncertainty. Passage after passage opened before him as he followed the strand that had marked his path, and the phosphorescent glow that had seemed so dim during his descent now seemed almost bright by comparison to the darkness of the chamber he had left behind. The maze that had taken hours to penetrate required far less time to traverse in reverse, though whether this was due to the thread's properties or to some change in the labyrinth itself, he could not determine. At the entrance, dawn light filtered through the archway like a benediction, and there Theseus found the other young Athenians waiting with expressions that mixed relief with amazement. They had emerged from various passages throughout the night, for the labyrinth had proved less deadly than expected when its central purpose had been fulfilled. Some had wandered for hours before finding their way back to familiar passages, while others had discovered that paths they remembered as leading deeper into the maze now seemed to curve back toward the entrance, as though the very structure had reorganized itself. The news of the Minotaur's death spread through the palace with the speed of wind across water, bringing with it reactions that ranged from amazement to relief to a strange kind of grief. King Minos himself received the report with a complexity of emotion that spoke to the burden he had carried for years. For the creature's death meant not just the end of the tribute, but also the conclusion of a story that had defined much of his reign. There was loss in his expression, for the Minotaur had been part of his family's history. Yet, there was also something that might have been gratitude for a resolution that he had never dared to hope for. Princess Ariadne prepared quickly for departure, gathering only those possessions that held personal meaning rather than monetary value. Her choice had been made during the long night of waiting, and she felt no regret even as she said farewell to the palace that had been her home since birth. The thread that had guided Theseus through the labyrinth had also drawn her toward a future she could not yet imagine, but which called to her spirit with a voice stronger than the claims of duty or tradition. The ship that had brought black sails to Crete now prepared to depart with white ones, carrying word of victory back across the sea to Athens. The young people who boarded were changed by their experience, marked by the knowledge that they had participated in something larger than their individual lives, that they had been part of a story that would be told for generations yet to come. They moved with the quiet dignity of those who have faced ultimate tests and discovered reserves of courage they had not known they possessed. As the ship cleared the harbor and set course for home, the island of Crete diminished behind them until it became just another line on the horizon, just another memory among the many they carried. The wind filled their white sails with the promise of homecoming, and dolphins once again played in their wake, as though celebrating the completion of an ancient cycle. The sea around them sparkled with reflected sunlight, and the sky stretched above them clear and blue as the mantle of Athena herself. Yet the story was not yet complete, for stories that touch the realm of the gods seldom conclude with simple happiness. The ship made a stop at the island of Naxos to take on fresh water and supplies, and here the threads of fate that seemed to guide all heroic tales revealed their complexity, whether through divine intervention, mortal failing, or simply the pressure of events too large for any individual to control entirely. Theseus found himself sailing away from Naxos without Princess Ariadne, leaving her sleeping on the beach like a beautiful figure in a dream that dissolves with waking. The reasons for this abandonment would be debated by storytellers for generations to come. Some would say that the god Dionysus claimed Ariadne for his own, appearing to Theseus in a dream with commands that could not be disobeyed. Others would suggest that the princess herself chose to remain, understanding that her destiny lay not in Athens, but in a different story entirely, one that would transform her into something more than mortal. Still others would maintain that Theseus, despite his heroism, possessed the flaws that make mortals human, and that his departure represented a failure of constancy that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. Whatever the truth behind the parting, the ship sailed on toward Athens with its cargo of rescued youth and its burden of incomplete resolution. The black sails that had marked their departure as a tribute ship had been changed to white to signal their victory. Yet, in the confusion and sorrow of leaving Naxos, this crucial detail was forgotten, overlooked in the weight of more immediate concerns. Thus it was that King Aegeus, watching from the cliffs above Athens harbor as he had watched every day since his son's departure, saw black sails on the horizon and understood them to mean what they had always meant before, that the ship returned empty of all save sorrow, that another group of young Athenians had been claimed by the labyrinth, that his son numbered among the lost. The grief that overwhelmed him in that moment was beyond the capacity of mortal hearts to bear while maintaining their connection to life. And the king threw himself from the cliff into the sea that would thereafter bear his name. Theseus arrived in Athens as both hero and mourner, savior of his city's youth and cause of his father's death, living embodiment of the truth that even the greatest victories carry within them the seeds of loss and regret. The celebration of the Minotaur's defeat was tempered by mourning for the king, and the prince who had sailed away in hope of ending one cycle of sorrow found himself at the center of a new pattern of joy and grief intertwined. The palace that welcomed him was the same structure of marble and bronze that he had left, yet it felt different now, marked by absence as much as presence, by the weight of choices made and their unforeseen consequences. The olive trees still rustled in Athena's breezes, and the city still spread below the Acropolis like a tapestry of white stone and red tile. Yet Theseus walked through it all with the knowledge that heroism is more complex than legends suggest, that victory often comes at costs that cannot be calculated in advance. In the days that followed his return, as Athens mourned its king and celebrated the end of the tribute, Theseus found himself wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The labyrinth was empty now, its purpose fulfilled, and its guardian at rest. Yet the patterns of cause and consequence that had created it continued to ripple outward through time and space, touching lives in ways that no one could predict or control. The thread that had guided him through the maze of passages had served its purpose perfectly, yet it could not guide him through the more complex labyrinth of mortal existence, where every choice created new paths and new possibilities for both triumph and tragedy. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur would be told and retold through generations, growing in some tellings and diminishing in others, acquiring details that served the needs of different audiences while losing nuances that spoke to the complexity of truth. Yet at its heart would always remain the image of a young man, following a thread through darkness toward an encounter that transformed not just his own life, but the very nature of the relationship between Athens and Crete, between mortals and the consequences of divine displeasure, between the cycles of violence that seem to govern human affairs, and the possibility that such cycles might sometimes be broken by acts of courage and compassion. The labyrinth itself gradually fell into ruin, its passages slowly filling with earth and debris, until they became just another layer in the accumulated history of human civilization. Yet something of its essence remained, for labyrinths exist not just in stone and bronze, but in the patterns of choice and consequence that every soul must navigate, in the mazes of desire and duty that wind through every human heart. The thread that Ariadne had given to Theseus became a symbol that transcended its original purpose, representing the connections that bind us to hope even in the darkest passages of existence, the assurance that no matter how lost we become, some part of us remembers the way home. As night falls across the ancient world and stars emerge one by one like the eyes of sleeping gods opening to survey their creation, the story settles into the realm of memory and dream, where all stories eventually find their home. The olive trees that crowned the hills of Athens continue their eternal rustling, carrying whispers of all the tales that have been told beneath their branches, while across the wine dark sea, the island of Crete dreams of bulls and labyrinths, of princesses who became goddesses and heroes, who learned that victory and sorrow are often the same gift viewed from different angles, in temples dedicated to Athena and Poseidon, in Dionysus and Aphrodite. Priests tend fires that have burned since before memory began, maintaining the connections between the mortal world and the realm of the immortals, who shape mortal destinies according to patterns too vast for human comprehension. The smoke from these fires rises into the starlit sky like prayers made visible, carrying with it the hopes and fears of generations who have looked to the gods for meaning in the labyrinthine complexity of existence. The dolphins that played in the wake of the tribute ship continue their eternal dance through Mediterranean waters, bearing no memory of the particular vessel they once followed, yet somehow carrying within their graceful movements the joy that marks the completion of any story well told. They leap and dive beneath stars that have watched empires rise and fall, beneath constellations that served as guides for heroes whose names have been forgotten, and heroes whose deeds are still sung in halls where wine flows like liquid starlight, in the deeper places of sleep, where dreams touch the edges of prophetic vision. Mortals sometimes find themselves walking through passages that seem familiar, yet strange, following threads that gleam like captured moonbeams toward encounters that will transform their understanding of what it means to be human. These dream labyrinths connect all times and places, all stories, and all souls, weaving together the individual threads of existence into patterns that reveal meaning only when viewed from the perspective of eternity. The thread that guided Theseus through his labyrinth becomes in these deeper dreams a golden cord that connects every seeker to every goal, every lost soul to every possibility of redemption, every ending to every new beginning. It reminds dreamers that no matter how dark the passages they must traverse, no matter how complex the choices they must make, some part of them always remembers the way toward light, toward love, toward the peace that comes when stories find their proper conclusions. And so the ancient tale dissolves into the gentle rhythms of sleep and dream, becoming part of the vast library of stories that humanity carries within its collective heart. Stories that serve as maps through the labyrinth of existence, and as reminders that courage and compassion can sometimes transform even the most tragic circumstances into something approaching grace. The voices of the storytellers fade into the whisper of wind through olive branches. The glow of ancient fires dims to the soft phosphorescence of stars reflected in still water. And the eternal dance of memory and dream continues its ancient patterns beneath skies that hold all stories within their infinite embrace. Rest now, weary traveler, for the labyrinth has been navigated and the monster given peace. Let the thread of this story guide you into dreams where heroes still walk beneath starlit skies, where princesses become goddesses through the transformative power of love, where every ending carries within it the promise of new beginnings, as eternal as the rhythm of waves against ancient shores. Sleep and dream of bulls dancing beneath the light of silver moons, of dolphins leaping through seas that reflect the very face of eternity, of threads that connect all hearts to all hopes across the vast and wondrous labyrinth of existence.